Hey, Will, I threatened earlier, I think, to show you some poems in the class. I showed you some bad poems that my lab threw back and forth, but I should probably throw in some inspiring, fabulous poems through the ages as well. The poem's due on the 1st, which is really just a couple of weeks away. And we all know who the biologists are. We know who the ecologists are. We know the taxonomists and the wildlife majors. We know the environmental science majors, but we don't really know who the poets are. And so this is your chance to shine and really, show, let your freak flag fly and show who you really are behind the crusty exterior of a scientist, right? And I personally love poetry, and but it's not really a dark secret, but it is my secret. Maybe it's not the secret. I love poetry, and as I told you earlier in the quarter, it's part of the tradition of the class. And so, so I encourage you to throw a little effort into it. And once again, I'll remind you that when we get your poems on the 1st, we'll scramble through our we'll scramble and put them through our intense panel of judges to rate the best poem, which is really antithetical to the idea of poetry, but it makes it kind of fun. And then a few people will perform it, and in exchange for a high value reward. So anyway, I hope you're into it. I just wanted to give you a couple of examples of poems. This is something you probably suffered through in high school, and you were like, spare me. But it's actually kind of a great poem, The Fish by Elizabeth Bishop. And it's a great poem because there's an arc to it. She catches a fish. It's an amazing fish. She lets the fish go. And everything in between is observation and feeling and a little bit of psychedelia thrown in. And as newly minted fish biologists, you might have some new appreciation for some of the taxonomic details that she throws in here, which are pretty astute. She's clearly a woman who spent time fishing. She's clearly a woman who spent time around motors and on the water. I just highlighted a few lines here. Pick up my amazing pointer here. The frightening gills, fresh and crisp with blood, that can cut so badly. Well, you know why they cut. It's those gill rakers, right? And the bronchiostegal arches that are below them that can slice your fingers if you get your fingers in there. And they're also used for helping to process food and direct the flow of water. That's what she's referring to there. And then she talks about the coarse white flesh. She thinks of the coarse white flesh packed in like feathers. That's interesting. We've seen how the myomeres nest inside each other, and maybe that's kind of like an avian kind of feather-like look. I think that's what she's talking about, is the nesting of the myomeres there. And then she talks about the swim bladder, which is pink, like a big peony. Peony is a big flower, you find mostly in gardens on the East Coast. And then she goes down and she admires his sullen face. And the fishes that we've seen, they have these like serious pouts. You can't see it through my mask, but it's because of the mechanism of their jaws, right? That elaborate mechanism with the maxilla and the premaxilla and the dentary bone and the structures that allow them to move it. And she admires that. Who thinks about that? Well, we do. And so did she. She's a poet. And then she talks about the hooks that are hanging out of his lip, if you could call it a lip, because it's not really a lip. It's not like ours. Anyway, and then she throws in a little tag at the end. I'm not going to read the whole poem, obviously, but she throws in a little tag about the pool of bilge where oil had spread a rainbow around the rusted engine. And I just really like that line because it's a mix of industrial and the beautiful, light spreading in the rainbow. And she lets the fish go. Anyway, that's a pretty cool poem about a fish. In my opinion, coming back to it like 40 years later or something, the first time I read it, I was like, please. And now I'm like, yeah, that appeals to a fish biologist. And then on the other end of things, there's Hamlet. Hamlet's a great play. It's all about death. one of my favorite topics. And I'm sure, I'm just joking, not really. But anyway, as a poet, you have to be a little bit into depth. And that's what Hamlet is all about. Hamlet is really hung up. He's kind of losing his mind because his dad got killed, but he doesn't have the evidence. The guy who killed his dad married his mother. It's his uncle. And he's flipping out because he's trying to figure out a way to indict this man and get rid of him, but he can't actually seal the deal. He can't figure it out. So he's running around, taking out his wrath and frustration on everybody. He kills the wrong guy. And so the king, which is his uncle who killed his father, says, what happened to Polonius? Because he knows that Hamlet killed Polonius. They're trying to find the body. And Hamlet says, he's at supper. And Claudius says, at supper, where? Hamlet says, not where he eats, but where he's eaten. A certain convocation of politic worms are eaten at him. Your worm is your only emperor for diet. We fat all creatures, else to fat us. And we fat ourselves for maggots. The fat king and your lean beggar is but variable service, 2 dishes, but 1 to the table. And that's the end. And Claudius gets the picture. He's like, oh my God, the guy's lost his mind and he's killed Polonius. And then here's the great line that ties it into fish. A man may fish with the worm that's eaten of a king and eat of the fish that has fed of that worm. And that's nothing but to show you how a king may go a progress through the guts of a beggar. So there's some, I don't know, early revolutionary poetry for you. Shakespeare's a great example of like highly structured poetry. It's written in iambic pentameter. Iambic means that the alternate symbols are emphasized. So there's an emphasized symbol and a de-emphasized syllable. And that's kind of how we speak actually naturally in the English language. We kind of have an iamb cadence to our speech. And you can hear that in rap and hip hop too, right? It totally plays off of that natural bup, 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 bup. And the pentameter refers to lines and couplets, that is iambs or couplets, pairs of syllables. So you have 10 syllables per line, more or less. And that's the constraint that he worked with, because that was the constraint of the time. A lot of poems have constraint. I haven't found any hip hop poems yet, rap poems about fish, but I'm looking. And maybe you'll produce something more contemporary like that. Anyway, that's poems. It's 2% of your grade, amazingly, which probably won't do much, but hopefully it's a lot of fun, and we'll entertain ourselves on the last day of class, which I hope to be a fun day. This week, 2 readings that I've thrown up on Canvas about rockfishes. They just came out last week, and they're pretty interesting, and they have to do with extraordinary long lives that these fish have. They and how that confers fitness and what that means evolutionarily. So I'd really like you to peruse them. One of the articles is a little headier than the other article. One's sort of like the soft touch, the outreach article, and the other is the actual science article. So take a look and slog through the science piece, the actual technical piece, and also look at the puff piece as well, because that'll tell you what the hard piece was talking about. Nice thing about science is that the articles are short, because everyone who reads science doesn't have any time for long articles. It's all just synthesis and get in, get out. I'm going to do the quiz on Friday this week. And a reminder that the topics for the blogs were due last Friday. So if your group, hopefully you all have groups. If you don't have a group, then we got to get on that. And hopefully your group has sent a topic for a blog to Rochelle. I haven't checked in with her, but I'll check in with her later. But please get on that so that we can make it happen. We've really just got a couple of weeks left. As I said, I don't know the exact date for the blog, but it's coming up in probably about 2 weeks. But I think just after Thanksgiving, and then the poem's due on the 3rd, and then the midterm is on the 10th, which is just insane. It's the quarter system. Any questions about that? Okay, cool. Today I'm going to talk about Paracanthopterygians and Acanthopterygians. We met the Paracanthopterygians before as some of the deep sea fish. The anglerfish is a Paracanthopterygian. But the cods are also included in that group, and I really want to talk about cods because they're really important as a fishery and had a major influence on the history of Western civilization. and the colonization of the Americas. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about them. And then I want to hit the Acanthopterygians, which are the spiny finned fishes and a source of incredible diversity. Probably the most diverse group that we've seen yet in terms of the sheer number of adaptations and the number of families, orders and families that are tucked within it. But first, a little bit of art history. Because it's Monday, we'll do a soft start. So, you know, last time I talked about how the Greeks and Romans in classical art had like amazingly detailed depictions of fishes, like that were really accurate. So you can go back and identify the species pretty easily from, you know, a couple thousand years away. And towards the end of that period, the fish became more symbolic and less physically real. So the features became sort of generalized because the message behind it was no longer technical. The message behind it was, you know, became more spiritual, became more philosophical. And then the Christians co-opted it for that very reason, because it was a potent symbol. And as the Roman Empire was disintegrating in the late part of the 5th century CE, it led to some really interesting changes about the nature of art and science. So as the emperor declined, the last Roman emperor, I think, was in 476, and the Pope, who was the spiritual center of this newly developed Catholic Church, he became the new emperor. There's an emperor there actually in Rome who was the sort of spiritual emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, and there was also an Eastern Roman Empire, which had a different trajectory. But this was a function of Germanic and Norse tribes that had sort of appropriated the northern end of the empire and then sacked Rome, and then basically set up their own nation states across the continent. And the Christian groups centered with the Pope in Rome sent out missionaries. And these people were basically in control of knowledge, because literacy during the Roman Empire was quite high. And as it crumbled, literacy fell apart and learning fell apart and knowledge got lost. And so the main sources of knowledge were monks. And monks were devoted to scriptures and sacred writings. And they were the few people who were literate tended to be religiously trained. And they were in charge of creating books, which are all done by hand. We still have copies of these books. They're often illuminated manuscripts, and they're beautiful. They're gorgeous. They have pictures drawn in the margins that make the manuscript itself glow. But that they were short on is any kind of like science or any kind of continuity with knowledge from previous civilizations. And so the Christian teachings basically supplanted classical sources, which were looked at with a lot of skepticism. And so at the same time, or around this period, you know, maybe symbolically, we think about it retrospectively, but there was a massive library in Alexandria in Egypt that was really, it was really kind of the center of learning in Alexandria. And that library burned. There's actually a very famous female historical character. Hypatia was the chief librarian, and she was killed, and the library was burned because it was, you know, I forget the whole details about it, but it was, I think it had something to do with like essentially suppressing pagan knowledge. And so, so with that library, a lot of scientific works that had been developed had been lost. And those that were retained were considered works by pagans. And so they were kind of considered inferior. And these are a couple of paintings that show, one is a painting that shows the sack of the library up on the top here. And then down here is a picture of Pope Theophilus, who's got his gospel in his hand, and he's standing atop the ruins of part of the library, the Serapeum. So during the period, this began what we call the medieval period, or the Middle Ages. Some people used to call it the Dark Ages. It's not really the Dark Ages, it was just a shift in understanding, a shift in knowledge and ideas. And so from 500 to 1500 in Europe, classical knowledge was lost to Western Europe and resided pretty much in the Islamic cultures of the Near East and Middle East and North Africa. And it wouldn't be for another Well, really, it took about 1,000 years for that to be rediscovered as a function, really, of the Crusades, which brought Western Europeans in contact with it for the first time. So medieval art during this period, just to get back to fish and art, medieval art in this period totally reflects that. So here's a picture from the 11th century of night fishing with a lamp and a net. It's a cool picture of the technology that they were using, but it's very, very generic. And you can look at the figures themselves. If you think back to like what you know about classical art, where you have these very sophisticated, anatomically and morphologically correct portrayals of humans and fishes. Everything here is very generic. Even the people are flat and one-dimensional, or two-dimensional, I should say. They don't have any depth to them. And of course, in these sorts of pictures, they're fishing. Fishing was this potent symbol at the time. And in this, there's an illuminated manuscript of music here in the lower left corner. And there's a little person who's fishing again, because that was the symbol of the time, right? And then this got incorporated later on during that period. This is from the early 1300s. This is one of the times that, so this is an image of Christ appearing on Lake Tiberias. And there was this miraculous catch of fishes that occurred after the men had been fishing all night. It happened a couple of times, once while Christ was alive and once when he came back. And they were considered like two of the miracles of Jesus. And the symbolism there is Peter, out fishing all night. He was a fisherman. Peter's one of the apostles, one of the followers of Jesus in the myth. And they're like, Jesus, just go fish over there in the other harbor, and go 200 feet out, you'll be fine. And so they pull up all these fishes, and then they're like, my God, how did you do that, man? And Jesus says, well, it's I got God on my side. Come be a fisher of men instead of a fisher of fish with me. And so this is the whole mythology that developed around fish that was furthered one more step with Jesus. And of course, his initials were Ichthyes, right? Jesus Christ, Son of God in Greek. So that, again, furthered the connection to fishes. And I talked about that a week or two ago. This is another portrayal of the same incident right here. And but this was done in the 1500s, about 100 or 200 years later, 200 years after the first one I showed you. And check it out. See how one-dimensional the characters are? And there's no background. And they're just kind of standing on the water there, like in a way you can't do. And boats don't look like that, right? Because it's a spiritual portrayal of a connection to their deity, right? Whereas this one, Raphael, was a famous Renaissance painter. He placed the scene in his own hometown, in a lake near where they live. That's a part of Europe. Those birds are storks, which are typical more of Europe than of the Middle East, though they go from Europe to North Africa, I think. But you look at that, look at the men, look at the musculature on their arms, look how they have dimension. They even have reflections on the water, and they're seated properly in the water in the landscape. And that's the difference. That's the kind of change that we're going to explore next time we meet, is that shift from really that spiritual kind of ethereal representation of humans and creatures around them to a more naturalistic representation, which corresponded to the recapturing of classical knowledge in the Renaissance. We'll get to that next time. We'll talk about that a little bit more. But before I move on and actually get to biology, since I'm going on and on here, I just wanted to mention the bestiaries. So there were a couple of famous monks. There's Isidore of Seville and the Venerable Bede, who were famous for their manuscripts. And they did these bestiaries, especially in the late Renaissance, in the late medieval period. The Crusades had started, and some of the people who came back, some of the wealthy people who came back, they wanted descriptions of the things they had seen. They got off the farm and they saw incredible stuff out there, and so they wanted descriptions of the animals and fishes and plants that they had seen. And so these monks just made it up. They found these kind of second-rate poor translations of some of the Greek, like Pliny the Elder's detailed scientific observations, and they just started making up stuff. And they put together chimeras, these mixes of animals. And again, you look at the fish. The fish is just a fish. It's just a fish. It's not really, anything that you would really identify. In the mouth looks like a person. And that's, sort of intentional because a lot of the narratives, again, that they were putting into this had to do with ethical stuff, had to do with moral stuff. So it's not just that, fish are uncountable and that there's so many different types of breeding and reproduction, you can't even talk about it, which is almost true, as we found out. But we've broken it down in this class, as you've seen. But the more important thing here is that male fish do not commit adultery with fishes of other species. And so during this period, all these stories and portrayals of art were really designed like with this ethical, spiritual sense, and they were not invested in science at all. So, and then the Renaissance really kind of changed all that and still informs the culture that we live in today. That's why I spent so much time talking about it, I guess. Maybe because it feels like we're actually moving farther and farther away from science. And maybe some of our art even actually represents that change, if you think about it. So hang tight. Let's talk about fish. Okay, so I want to talk about the Paracanthopterygii. I talked about I did not talk about the Batrachoideformes, which are toadfish, and I'm not gonna, but I did talk about the Lophiiformes, which were the anglerfish, and today I'm gonna talk about the Gadiformes. So let's jump right into it. This family, order Gadiforme, and family Gadidae are the cods. And cods are characterized by the fact that they have cycloid scales, which you've heard of before. They've got 2 or 3, usually 3. So the classic cod has 3 distinct dorsal fins. That's the Atlantic cod. But usually they have 2 or 3 that are completely separate, and they have this little chin barbel, a little noodle that comes off of the lower jaw that makes them very distinct and easy to identify. And they're big fish. They can weigh up almost 80 pounds. They can be almost 2 meters, and they can live a long time. They include the cods. The group includes cods, haddock, and pollock, all of which are really important Atlantic fisheries, and to a lesser extent Pacific fisheries. They're a bottom dweller. They feed on invertebrates and other benthos. You can see that the main distribution for the Atlantic cod, Gadus morua, is up in the North Atlantic, on both the Western Atlantic and the Eastern Atlantic, along Europe and the coast of North America. And the abundance of cod and the distribution of cod really incentivized people not only to start fishing it locally in Europe in around the 1400s, but it also encouraged them to move across the Atlantic Ocean because there was a lot of money to be had in fishing for cod and bringing it back. You see that this particular, that the Atlantic cod are somewhat vulnerable right now. And I'll talk about the reasons why they're vulnerable in a few minutes here. Vikings initially colonized North America back in the 9th and 11th centuries. And that knowledge of the fact that there was a continent, it wasn't Columbus, by the way. Columbus sort of popularized it for the rest of Europe, but the Vikings initially colonized North America and then retreated because they found life difficult there, and the native peoples pushed back pretty severely. And so if they found it not in their interest to continue it, but the Basque fishers apparently, so the Basques were important seafaring people from Southern Europe who initially developed the cod fishery, and they figured out that there was an important extension of the cod fishery across the Atlantic Ocean, and presumably they were out there way before Columbus got there as well, bringing cod back. What's the whole thing with cod? Why is cod so important in Europe? Well, one, it's a really important source of protein, right? And 2, there's actually a Christian connection once again, because in the Christian religion, it's mandated that one doesn't eat meat on Fridays. And that led to a huge demand for seafood on those days. And so and people would pay a premium to get seafood when it became competitive to find it. And the Basques were sort of the first group of people to try to satisfy that market. And so the Basque fishers were the first to colonize. It's not really clear where they went ashore, but they did go over and fish the like George's Bank off the coast of New England in all likelihood. And then after Columbus got over there and popularized this idea by blabbing about it and talking about the riches and bringing back slaves. The French, the Portuguese, and the English jumped on the bandwagon. And so just by a few years later, there were about 50 ships going across the Atlantic and returning with salt cod every year. Salt was used to preserve it. And so they pack the fish, they clean the fish, they pack them they dry them, they pack them in these giant barrels with salt, which would preserve it, and they bring it back. And by this market only blew up. And by 1600, there were about 150 ships per year. This was a non-trivial trip, right? There had to be a lot of money to be made on it in order to facilitate it. By the 1800s, this sort of simple fishery had grown into an enormous international trade, and it was fueled by fish, by sugar, rum, tea, and human trafficking. This was the foundation of the slave trade from Africa, North America, and Europe. And this was called a triangular trade. And so slave ownership in England was banned in 1772, but merchants in England still were invested in it and still making money on it for many, many decades out. And the way they did it was by facilitating this cross-continental international trade. So to just make it brief here, because it's kind of complicated, we'll start with fish because that's what we're talking about. So codfish were fished up here off of New England, and the fish, along with flour and grains and stock and lumber for building, were shipped down south to the West Indies and also to the south coast of North America here. And in exchange, humans were brought back as slaves to the southern, actually to all the colonies. Here it sort of points to the south. It's not true. There were slaves all throughout the colonies, as we know. And they also came back with molasses and sugar. Actually, they do show it here. Okay, so I needn't be so skeptical. So they came back with slaves, molasses, and sugar that they delivered to those ports, which then in turn were sent back to England, which was more industrialized. So along with like lumber and furs and molasses and sugar, they went and they processed these stuff, basically turning the molasses and sugar into rum and then sending that back across the Atlantic to the colonies, and also processing this stuff into tools that could be used to maintain their colonial power in Africa, which would allow them to export human beings and gold and ivory and other valuable materials back to Europe. So that's what they called the triangular trade, because it involved humans, it involved rum, and it involved fish as well. Fish sort of initiated it, and then more valuable things took over. And just as a testimony to like how real this was, how important it was, this is a picture up in the upper left-hand corner of the sacred cod. It's a codfish that hangs in the State House in the legislature in Massachusetts. And you can look around on buildings and you'll see cod over the mantles of doors, you'll see cod veins. And then Cape Cod itself was named for the intense fishery. A lot of this is discussed in a book called Cod and another book called Salt by Mark Kurlansky. And if you're interested in this stuff, I really recommend checking it out, because it's just fascinating how one fish sort of paved the way for things that still resonate with us today, including where we live. Because of the high fecundity of these fish, there's millions of eggs per female are laid annually, and they live for 20 years. So it was thought to be an unexploitable resource. I mean, when people started thinking about this in the post-war period, we developed the technology for people to get out close to the fisheries and capture them very efficiently. And so, so early stock evaluations are like, no problems with the cod, they just keep producing. And that high fecundity in terms of egg production per female was not necessarily reality, because fertility is very different than fecundity. Fecundity has to do with the number of eggs produced. Fertility has to do with the success of the offspring in becoming adults. And fertility began to decline Again, with the increase in post-war prosperity and fossil fuels, which gave people engines, which gave people access to resources and the ability to exploit them much more intensively. And about 30 years after, 40 years after that intensification of pressure, by about the mid-1990s, we started to see this freaky decline in stocks, the most reliable fishery in the world. And if you look at these graphs here, the declines are not, so there's separate populations in the North Atlantic of cod. There's the European population, which is indicated right here. And one of those is very much in jeopardy. So the red circles are populations that are really in jeopardy. They're the same species, but different populations. The yellow circles less threatened, but still of concern. And the green circles way up here in the Arctic Circle are pretty much intact populations. And so just to back up a little bit, you can see in the Barents Sea population, which is pretty much intact, you can see that it's been pretty consistent through that period. But a more vulnerable population in the North Sea has really declined and then stabilized. And then the Georges Bank over here on the West Atlantic is really kind of jeopardized. And you know, if you look at the axis here, the left axis, we're talking 2 million tons of catch, as opposed to say 200,000 up here in the North Sea catch. So this is a giant fishery. They're pulling out millions and millions. At one time, they were pulling out 6 or 7 million tons of fish per year. And so now it's down to, you know, less than a million, more like, you know, 100,000, 200,000. So that stock is really concerned because it's kind of a mainstay of the fishery. So in the 90s, we started seeing these trends. And in addition to the less fish, there was also a decrease in size. So in the 1930s, remember shifting baselines, we talked about this. It also happened with the cod fishery. In the 1930s, fish would mature in 9 years about, and they would reach a length of about 85 centimeters or 5 kilos. By the 2000s, they were on average 10 centimeters shorter, and they were maturing at 7 years. And this is indicative of what? Any guesses? Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They're pulling out all the older females. And so the more successful females are ones that can reproduce earlier at a smaller size. And so it's a typical pattern in an overexploited fishery when you start to see not just declining species. Sometimes the population will remain stable, but the biomass might be shifting. If you're not checking for biomass, you might not detect it. And if you're checking for size, this is another thing to detect that a fishery is in jeopardy. And so people have been studying this for decades. Obviously, one of the world's most important fisheries, a huge source of income, not only for Europe and North America in general, but also in the late 20th century, it became, well, over the course of 300 years of fishing, some cod cultures developed up in New England and especially in Canada, in Newfoundland and Labrador, villages and really distinct cultures with types of music and dress and fishing technology had developed over the course of hundreds of years that were pretty much undermined, pretty much destroyed those cultures. And those towns, you know, are still in the process of kind of being disappeared and going away. So a lot of them, some of them have been working with scientists to try to figure out this problem. This has been an interesting relationship between former fishers and scientists to figure out what's going on. A lot of research has been poured into it. And it seems as if the emerging conclusion about 20 years later, or more really, that we're getting is that there's an interaction between warming seas and fishing pressure and competition. And I'm going to go back to this slide here. You can kind of, you know, this is like when, you know, if you didn't know about global change, like in 1995, people weren't talking about climate change all the time. But if you know it from if you look at it from our perspective, you know, it's interesting that it's the north, like the Barents Sea circumpolar fisheries up in the Arctic Circle that are less impacted. And in fact, we're in some ways increasing, whereas the fisheries at lower latitudes were really declining. And so of course now we say global warming. And it's probably true. Warming seas had something to do with that decline in those southern fisheries, but also fishing pressure. And it's, once we've talked about this before, I think, once a population gets stressed and then you add intensification of pressure or fishing pressure, you make that population, which was once invincible, extremely vulnerable. And so, so you can see here, this is the, on the left, the stocks that are doing well are, so let me see, this is the fraction of stock harvest each year. And so in the stocks that were doing poorly, you can see that fishing pressure kind of maintained constant up here. The stocks that are doing better, there was less fishing pressure. At the same time, you can see this is a plot of temperatures over the past, really over 100 years, and you can see that all these regions, and let's just take a look at, say, the North Sea here. So the North Sea temperatures have gone way up, have spiked way up. The North Atlantic in general have spiked. I mean, they've all gone up. And they've gone up faster than average global temperatures, which is here in black on the bottom. So those are the kind of the two indicators that, really, and when they've run the models, that show that there is a really interactive effect in terms of fishing pressure and temperature change. And the fish in the north are actually doing better because the water is warming up a little bit, creating faster growth, faster reproduction. They actually like a little bit. So a less productive fishery in the north is now becoming more productive, whereas the fish in the more southerly distributions are less productive because they're more thermally stressed. Question?
Yeah, I was curious if you know that there's a correlation between the climate change and fishing pressure as far as longer fishing season because of better days for a longer period of time.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so it depends on how the fishery is managed, right? So usually there's openers for fisheries. That's one way we regulate them, is by having an opener of a set number of days. And if that window got wider, there may have been more openers, but I suspect that fisheries managers would have been regulating it more effectively, at least in the United States. Cod are, US fisheries are more or less well managed now. But the problem with cod is that they're a multi-nation fishery, right? Because they're offshore. And so, one nation can manage them. If the others aren't on board, then it's going to be trouble. I can't really answer your question, but I can speculate. So then there's another thing here I put in competition. So this is another aspect to this, which is just being explored. After fishing pressure was released, so they shut down the fishery, and a lot of these communities were really devastated, but they shut down these fisheries, and the cod didn't come back, which again, we think, aha, climate change. But it turns out it's probably more than climate change. It's actually affecting the ecosystem in broader ways. And try and follow me through this plot here. I'll try and walk you through it. So before cod overfishing, cod were like the dominant predator in the North Atlantic. And they fed on a variety of other fishes like hake and anchovy and sardine, I believe. Sardine? Yeah, sardines, yeah. And squid. And those animals, in turn, fed on smaller organisms, particularly smaller. That might be too complicated right now. Let me just cut for the first. Let me just do a first cut on this. So they fed on these organisms. They basically suppressed the population of these smaller fishes that are planktivores or feed on smaller fishes. It's a many-trophic food web. So big fish feed on smaller fish feed on even smaller fish, which feed on zooplankton, which feed on larval fish, right? That's the basic food web that they're talking here on the left. Excuse me. So when the cod were depleted, what happens is you had less cod and less predation pressure from the top. And some of these smaller fishes like hake became much more abundant. And they started feeding, because it was available, they started feeding on, and because there was more pressure to do this, they started feeding on different types of zooplankton, including larval plankton of cod. And so it's thought that once the cod population was suppressed, it actually allowed the predators of juvenile cod to explode, which sort of short-circuited cod's ability to reproduce. And if that's the case, then we've entered sort of an alternate steady state, which makes it very, very difficult to restore this fishery because essentially we've allowed its competitors to take advantage of the situation. So that's one of the theories about this. There's a little bit more to this plot. Does that make sense? I kind of stumbled through that. It makes sense. I see a head nodding there. Thank you. So there's a little bit more to this plot as well, though. The shift in the food web in this hypothesized paper, or this paper that hypothesizes about this, the shift in the food web has led the bulk of this intermediate food web organisms to shift to larger kinds of plankton over here on the left. And you can see by the size of the arrows. Formerly, they were feeding on small bugs or small zooplankton, which were feeding largely on diatoms. Now they've shifted, they speculate, they've shifted over to the left here. They're feeding on cod larvae, they're feeding on larger zooplankton, and those are in turn are, because they're feeding on the zooplankton, there's been a boom of dinoflagellates and mixtotrophs. And because they've released pressure from the smaller zooplankton, the abundance of small zooplankton, are you with me so far? The abundance of small plankton has depressed the abundance of small diatoms. It's a trophic cascade. You suppress the top animal, and the next trophic level starts to increase in abundance. That next trophic level, the mid-range fishes, increasing in abundance, suppress the next trophic level, which in this case is zooplankton. The release of grazing pressure from zooplankton leads to a bloom of a certain type of phytoplankton. Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot like that. Yeah, exactly, because that grazing pressure has been removed, right? So, short story long, the shift in cod as a top predator has led to, fishing down the marine food web. We're sort of moving down to a different size class. Everything's, and pressure is accordingly shifting in the food web. And that decrease in the number of diatoms, which presumably acted as a kind of, diatoms are really important in the ecosystem because they do two things. They release oxygen and they sequester carbon dioxide. So as they consume carbon dioxide, they live out their life cycle, they'll release some oxygen, but then they die and fall down to the bottom in marine sediments. And that's an important CO2 pump, essentially. And so they are speculating that it has climate change implications and that it's shifting the ocean's ability to sequester carbon dioxide. Of course, this whole process is also facilitated by climate change, which is leading to, so circulation patterns in the ocean are changing, and we're getting these sort of thermoclines or gradients in the water, which inhibit circulation of nutrients. And that may be, this lack of circulation of nutrients might be depressing phytoplankton production as well. Does that make sense? It was a lot. It's very complicated. I'm still wrapping my head around it. Turns out that phytoplankton production in the oceans is a major player in climate change. So a series of experiments in the 1980s, 1990s, where they dumped iron into ocean conditions, led to this massive bloom of phytoplankton. And it was speculated that, one way to reduce or reverse climate change, and shaking head there, is to dump iron or sink a battleship. Somebody, scientist famously said, give me a battleship and I'll give you an ice age. Because essentially the rust, iron is a limiting nutrient in ecosystems and in marine ecosystems. And so by throwing iron in, the Iron X experiment suggests that it's one way to reverse climate change. But there's problems with that, aren't there? What would you say the main problem is? Yeah. Of course, we don't know what climate change is going to do either, do we? We're kind of up against the wall, aren't we? Yeah, but that whole, anyway, that's a sidetrack, but you heard it here. Those are the Iron X experiments. Any questions about the cod and the cod food web and the shift that happened pre and post fishing? It's a complicated idea. There's lots of implications, but the thing that I really want you to get out of it is that there was a shift such that it released predation pressure off of the juveniles. Excuse me, there was a shift in that it increased predation pressure on the juveniles of cod, which made it very difficult for the population to be built back up. Got it? Okay, cool. All right, we've made it through. This is the last major taxonomic group, the last main suborder, and it just happens to be the most diverse. I'm going to focus on, you've already heard Andrew Ripple talk about the perciforms, which includes the centrarchids or sunfishes. And so you've gotten to dig into that a little bit. I'm going to talk about so these are the fishes that I thought you should know. It's only a subsample. And so I think you should know at least a little bit about each one of them. I may not talk about them in detail, but know who they are. And I'm really going to emphasize knowing about the centrarchids. You had a lecture on that, and also the scorpeniforms, which are down here, which are going to include the rock fishes that I'll discuss in a lecture or two. And yeah, those are the main groups that we're really going to do a deep dive on. And the others, just be familiar with some basic aspects of their life history. So what is an Acanthopterygian? It's, I said, it's an extremely diverse group. You know, the minnows are probably the most speciose group. And the Stenopterygians and the Cyclosquamatans and the Scopelomorphs, those are all those deep sea fishes in those groups here. Those are probably have the most biomass, but it's the Acanthopterygians that have the most diversity, the most number of families. And the key characteristics are that they have these spines, which we've discussed. They're very different than the rays, which are segmented and flexible. The spines are round, bony structures. They're not segmented. And they occur on the soft, in the front end or the anterior end of the dorsal, pectoral, and pelvic fins typically. So usually there'll be a spine or 1 to 5 spines followed by these soft rays. That's very diagnostic of a Acanthopterygian. And then the upper jaw, of course, we have to talk about the upper jaw. The mobility of the jaw and the protrusability of the jaw reaches new heights with the development of this thing called the ascending process. And this is a carp down here. And you can see some of the things we've talked about, the kinetoid bone right up here, which attaches to the premaxilla, which gives it a little bit of extra flexibility. And then there's the maxilla and the dentary, or the lower jaw here, which gave it that sucky face kind of thing. And on A up here is a cichlid, a type of Acanthopterygian. And in this case, the premaxilla is really highly evolved. It has an ascending process, which I talk about right here, and a descending process. The descending process forms the front end of the mouth, the upper jaw, if you want, of the mouth. And the ascending process is this thing that slides up and down on the rostrum, which allows it to slide way out in front and attain even newer heights of protrusibility and strangeness, I might add. And in addition to that, they have really sophisticated pharyngeal jaws and dentition, and the musculature and ligamentous attachment of the bones allows for kind of really sophisticated manipulation, both in capturing prey and in processing it as well. And then they have, in the last minute here, and I'll let you go, they also have the typical characteristics, sort of teleostean fishes, which include less cycloid scales and more ctenoid scales, the more odd-shaped scales, which are adapted for specific purposes. They have a physoclistic swim bladder, 2 dorsal fins, and then their pectoral fins are much more lateral in general, and the pelvic fins are moved up to the anterior. So those are identifying characteristics, and then tomorrow we'll pick it up and run into some of the details of these groups.